Welcome back. As we mentioned, this is the polite way to put it. Mixed messages tonight coming from Rudolph Giuliani on whether or not Trump will answer Robert Mueller's questions on obstruction of justice. Earlier today, Giuliani told our guest Jonathan Lemire of the Associated Press that President Trump would not answer Mueller's questions on obstruction of justice in writing or in person. Quote, "That's a no-go. That is not going to happen," Giuliani said. There will be no questions at all on obstruction. Meanwhile, Giuliani tells NBC News earlier tonight that obstruction questions are, quote, "not ruled in or out." We have asked Jonathan Lemire to stay with us for this conversation, and joining in the conversation, Chuck Rosenberg, former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, also a veteran, former senior official of the FBI. So, Jonathan, because we're talking about your interview, it's been said one side of this matters, not what Rudy says, but when does it start mattering, these changes back and forth, just in the time since your interview with him?
Yeah, I mean, Rudy Giuliani, first of all, this is not the first time he's been inconsistent.
Right.
And certainly as much as his title is president's lawyer, he's far more president's legal spokesman, being much more the public face of this. And part of that is to sort of move the goalposts on to what would need to happen for the president to sit down for an interview with the special counsel, but also to shape public perception as to what that interview could be, eventually with, of course, the end game being Mueller, we believe, will write a report that'll end up at DOJ to Congress, and they'll make that decision, and he's playing to those Congress members and to the people who vote for them. That's where he is. That's his target audience. But as much as he gave mixed messages later tonight, he couldn't have been clearer with me when we spoke.
I have no doubt.
When we spoke early this evening, suggesting that two things: that there would be no questions about obstruction. The president would not field them, either in terms of a sit-down interview or written, though he did not discount the idea that he would take some written questions on the Russian collusion angle. And that's in response to the Mueller team's most recent letter just from a few days ago, signaling that they would be up for written questions on obstruction. But Rudy was very careful, again, to move those goalposts just a little, saying, well, we might be up for that, but we really want to talk about the idea of follow-up questions. We want to know, we're not sure we're going to be agreeing to any follow-up questions, and we want to have that matter settled before the president answers anything at all.
Okay, Chuck, you're out in the Pacific Northwest, and thank you for taking time out of your trip to join us. Does any of what Rudy says matter? And my question to you is, because Mueller cannot speak and will not speak, what should we know about how the feds view all of this?
Right. Good question. And I'll be polite, too. You used the phrase mixed messages, Brian. Rudy has been, Mr. Giuliani has been consistently inconsistent. It's absolutely stunning, but it's no longer surprising. But as a former federal prosecutor, I can tell you this. While the Mueller team would like to speak with the president, in fact, they'd like to speak with everybody who's involved in this investigation, they don't have to. Often in federal investigations, we don't get to talk to the target of the investigation. He's abroad, or he won't speak with us, or he invokes his Fifth Amendment privilege not to speak with us. And so you can finish an investigation without speaking to the president. If Bob Mueller decides he wants to push the issue, regardless of what Mr. Giuliani says, he simply issues a grand jury subpoena and litigates that. I don't know what he's thinking about doing because he won't talk. He's a professional, and that's the way professionals conduct themselves.
All right, so I'm asked to, I'm allowed to ask our lawyer in this case, what do you think about the possibility of what you just mentioned, a subpoena, knowing Mueller and his work as much as you do?
Yeah, that's a real tough call because you have to decide whether the reward, perhaps getting the president to speak, remember he could still invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege, is worth the risk. And the risk here is both litigating it and perhaps losing it, although I think that's unlikely, as well as the attendant delay. Again, because you don't have to speak to everybody in an investigation. You can speak to enough people and look at enough documents to have an idea, a very good idea, of what the president did and why he did it. Do I think that Bob Mueller will subpoena the president? I really don't know, Brian. I know it's tempting, but again, you have to weigh that risk and that reward.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.